Hello, and welcome to another episode of Coach and Coffee. As always, go get your coffee, then come back and we'll talk. It is extraordinarily sunny out today, so I'm wearing my sunglasses. My eyes do not like direct sunlight. Today we are talking about training in the heat. It's seasonally appropriate to talk about since it is now getting hot outside. It may have already been hot where you've been for a while, who knows, but he's chewing on one of my blocks of wood, great. Training in the heat, especially when you're first entering the hot time of the year after having trained outside in the cold or in cool buildings or whatever during the winter time, can be an adjustment. Some people naturally do better in the heat than others. I happen to be fortunate in that I do extremely well in heat in comparison to cold. My body tends to not do well in the cold. I have to take extra considerations as to what I'm going to wear and how I'm going to prepare for training or racing in the cold compared to in the heat. Yeah, just the way it is. But I know a lot of people who are on the opposite spectrum where they perform much better in the cold, or they don't need to take many considerations, but when it comes time for summer and heat and humidity, they perform less well, or they struggle the first few weeks or months of heat getting into things. So what should you do as the weather starts getting hotter and you still need to get your training in? It is extremely important to adapt. Training is all about adaptation. So that's true with muscular training, endurance training. It's also true for training for different temperatures. So if it's, 80 degrees out and 40, 50, 60% humidity, it's going to be significantly different than if it was 60 degrees out and 20% humidity. You're going to have to slowly adapt to the changes in heat. A few strategies I like to use. One is just spend time out in the heat not exercising, or lightly exercising. Like I make a very specific point to walk my dog more in the heat than other times of the year. He gets walked and exercised all the time anyway, but I try and spend time, especially when it first gets hot out, just being outside in the heat. So my body is just getting used to the feel of it again, getting used to everything again. And then my workouts for runs, when I'm first doing longer runs in the heat, I will generally take water with me on runs which of durations that I wouldn't normally take water in, like the winter time. So for instance, in the winter, cooler months, we'll just say cooler months, anything under an hour and a half, I will not take water with me. I don't need it. And that's dependent. I can go up to 3 hours without water depending on the terrain, the temperature, all that stuff. In the summertime, you will not catch me going 3 hours without water. So hydration is a huge consideration at the start when you're first adapting to the heat again. It is a better idea to have water with you than not. It's extremely important. You don't want to be out and realize you need water and you don't have access to any. So I will start out taking water with me as it gets hotter and everything on runs that I wouldn't necessarily normally do so, just in case. And then as the summer progresses, as I've adapted to the heat and everything better, and as I'm performing well and noticing that, I'll still have the water with me, but I won't use it unless I need it. And then there will be times eventually where I just won't bring it with me because I know I'm not going to need it. Last summer I did do some training runs up above 2 hours without water in the heat, so I live in kind of the middle of Virginia, so it gets to the 90s in the summer and some days get really humid, but I can do 90-degree days and do an hour and a half without water and be completely fine, just hydrate when I'm done. I won't feel off or anything at all. But that's person dependent. It's also depends on where you're running. Almost all of my longer runs are on trails, so there's a lot of coverage from plants and trees and everything from the sunlight, so I get less sunlight compared to someone who's doing a run on pavement where they're also heated way hotter because the asphalt's conveying so much heat as well. So your situation, what type of terrain you're running on also matters. It's a consideration that does play in. But gradual adaptation to the heat is the best way you can possibly go. You will perform better. Last year there was a race in, it's the DC Sprint. I think it's Mechanicsburg, Maryland. I might be getting that wrong and get confused on locations after a while. You can ask Luke. I mix up Fayetteville and Charlottesville and a bunch of other ones all the time. But last year at the DC Sprint, it was like 90-some degrees and over 70% humidity, and it just felt terrible. And it was a sprint, so it wasn't long or anything. But if you're not adapted to something like that, a race that might take you 35 minutes may end up pushing you to like 40 or 45 minutes, or you may not finish at all. You may not have hydrated, you may not be used to it, you may not be adapted, and so you get screwed. Further considerations outside of simply hydrating, electrolytes. Typically, every professional I've ever heard talk about Gatorade says that Gatorade has about twice the potency that it should. Like if you just buy a bottle of Gatorade, it's probably twice as much sugar and potassium and all that, sodium and everything in there that then you actually need to replenish. So if you water down a Gatorade, pour half into some other container, fill half with water, it's probably going to be fine. You also save a lot of money that way. But you do need some type of electrolyte if you're going to be doing longer runs or longer training sessions out in the heat. In the summertime, I love working out in the heat. It makes you feel like you're doing 2 times the work. Maybe you're not, but it makes you feel like it. And it's nice just to be out in the sun and get some vitamin D, sun absorption and all that. If you struggle in the heat, I recommend, instead of trying to extend your time in the heat, I'd recommend doing more sessions in the heat. So shorter sessions, but more frequently, as opposed to just sheer length of sessions. So maybe you're doing a run in the heat right now and it's 2 hours long and it's miserable and you feel awful, your body doesn't do well, you're noticing issues that come up with the heat, like heat exhaustion and things like that, starting to find their way in. So instead of doing 1 2-hour run, do 2 1-hour runs. Break them up. Another strategy you can use is using the mornings and evenings when it's cooler, not at the peak heat of the day at, like noon to 3 or noon to 4. Cooler times where it's still hot, so you get some of that adaptation in, but it's not going to be miserable and at its worst. All in all, heat is going to have a direct impact on your performance. Typically, when it's hotter out and you're sweating more, you're going to have a higher heart rate than if it was cool and you your body wasn't having to work as hard to keep you cool. So heart rate's going to be something that's factored in, but that's going to be true for everyone. Like I said at the start, different people are going to be affected differently, but it will be the case that everyone's going to be running with a higher heart rate when it's super hot out compared to when it's nice and cool out. It's a factor to consider though. So if you're doing heart rate training in the heat, I do the vast majority of my training by heart rate. I at least track it all the time. I don't always run based on it, but I do frequently. Just understand that those numbers are going to be different now in the heat compared to in the winter time. If you haven't experienced that before, you will see that happen very quickly. Yeah. If you have any questions, if there's anything I didn't cover and that you have questions about, or other strategies you think are very helpful, leave them in the comments below so other people can learn from those things. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Coach and Coffee.